The day started like any other for Jack Miller. He had been working on his latest project in the garage of his small home just outside the city. Nothing extraordinary, just fixing an old engine for a friend. The hum of his tools and the smell of motor oil filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept drifting back to the news broadcasts that had been circulating all week. Rumors of strange, unidentified craft in the sky. People had dismissed it as military testing, or maybe even some kind of scientific research. But deep down, Jack had a nagging feeling that something was wrong. That feeling became a harsh reality as the ground beneath his feet suddenly trembled. The sky above twisted, darkened, and a deep, thunderous roar reverberated through the air. His heart pounded in his chest as the unmistakable shape of a massive ship materialized, hovering just above the treetops. It wasn't like anything he had ever seen. A dark, gleaming, almost predatory structure, rippling with energy that seemed to pulse in the air like a heartbeat. Panic surged through Jack's veins, but there was no time to run. The ship began to lower, its engines whirring with an unnerving hum that shook the very foundation of the earth. Before he could react, a brilliant beam of light shot down from the underside of the craft, striking the ground with deadly accuracy. Everything around him went silent as if the world itself held its breath. He tried to move, tried to run, but the beam seemed to reach for him, pulling him upward with unnatural force. His feet left the ground, his body weightless as the beam enveloped him in an intense bright light. He felt a jolt of energy through his body. And then, without warning, the world around him went black. Jack awoke on cold metal, disoriented and nauseous. His limbs were bound, though not painfully so, but his mind raced with confusion and fear. The world around him was dimly lit, and strange symbols glowed faintly along the walls of the chamber. He tried to sit up, but his head spun, and he found himself unable to focus on anything for long. The air was thick with a strange scent, sterile and metallic. It felt wrong, as if he no longer belonged in the place he found himself in. A voice echoed from the shadows, sharp and commanding. It was unmistakably alien, but strangely smooth, almost melodic. "You are aboard a HFY vessel, human," the voice said. "Do not resist." Jack's blood ran cold at the mention of the HFY. The name had haunted every conspiracy theory and rumor about alien invaders, a race of immortal conquerors who had ruled the galaxy for centuries. They were supposed to be nothing more than myth, a distant legend that no one took seriously. But here he was, a prisoner of the very beings that had terrorized civilizations across the stars. He struggled against his restraints, his pulse quickening, but the voice continued, unbothered by his resistance. "You will comply, or you will be made to." Jack's eyes narrowed, his fear transforming into something colder, defiance. He had no intention of complying. He wasn't going down without a fight. The cold metal of the chamber pressed against Jack's skin as he slowly began to gather his bearings. His muscles ached from the sudden shock of the capture, but his mind was sharp. He wasn't about to give up, not yet. The voice that had spoken to him was still echoing in his head, a reminder that he wasn't alone, that the alien captors were watching. As the hours passed in the sterile silence of the cell, Jack couldn't help but wonder who exactly his captor was. He had heard stories of the HFY, though no one truly knew what they looked like. They were more of a whispered legend, a shadow in the far corners of galactic history. Some claimed they were a race of beautiful but deadly beings. Others said they were monstrous in appearance, covered in armor that made them look like walking war machines. Whatever the truth, Jack knew one thing for sure. The HFY weren't here for diplomacy. They were here for domination. His thoughts were interrupted by the faint hum of a nearby door opening. Jack's eyes snapped to the source of the sound, his body tense with anticipation. A figure stepped into the room, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway outside. She was tall, her silhouette commanding, and the faint glow of her features revealed a lithe, almost ethereal form. The voice from before belonged to her, but there was something else now, curiosity in her movements. She didn't approach immediately, instead standing at a distance, watching Jack with a studied gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, his muscles still tense, but he refused to break eye contact. The woman, this alien, was not the monster he expected. There was something unsettlingly graceful about her, something that didn't quite match the vicious nature of the Sarai Empire. Her eyes, deep and luminous, studied him with a keen intensity, as if searching for something beyond the surface. "Human," she spoke again, her voice less harsh now, more thoughtful. "Tell me your name." Jack clenched his jaw, his defiance unwavering. "You already know who I am," he spat. "You've got me trapped in your little metal cage. What else do you need?" The alien's lips tightened into something resembling a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I know who you are," she said, her tone shifting. "But I do not know why you resist." She paused, stepping closer. "Why fight when you know there is no escape? Why resist when you cannot win?" Jack's eyes narrowed. "Maybe because you think you've already won. Maybe I'm not the one who needs to be taught a lesson." The woman tilted her head, intrigued. The Sarai had crushed countless civilizations without ever encountering this kind of resistance. Most humans broke within days, their wills shattered by torture, or fear, or the weight of their captor's power. But Jack was different, defiant, fierce, unyielding. She stepped closer still, her voice quiet, but now tinged with an emotion Jack couldn't quite place. "I have seen hundreds of your kind come and go, and yet you are unlike them. Tell me, human, what makes you so different?" Jack didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered to the restraints on his wrists, his mind working furiously. His captor was more than just an alien interrogator. She was studying him, curious, something more than the cold, ruthless conqueror he had expected. Perhaps that curiosity was his chance. If he could keep her engaged, keep her off balance, maybe there was a way to exploit her weakness. The silence in the chamber grew thick as Jack and Elira locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. For a moment, Jack considered the alien's words. She wasn't like the mindless conquerors he had imagined. There was a depth to her presence, an intelligence that made her unpredictable. He had faced soldiers before, ruthless men who would stop at nothing to break him, but this was something entirely different. She was both beautiful and terrifying, graceful but commanding, an ancient, immortal being who seemed to have seen and done everything. Yet despite the terrifying power she wielded, there was something unsettlingly human in her gaze. "Why do you care?" Jack finally asked, his voice low but steady. "What do you gain by keeping me here? Why not just destroy me like the rest?" Elira's expression shifted, a flicker of something resembling confusion crossing her features. She opened her mouth to respond, but then stopped, as if reconsidering. Instead of answering, she studied him more closely, her gaze moving over his face, his posture, the clenched fists at his sides. She had never encountered a human who refused to break. Not like this. Not someone who was still so defiant despite being trapped, captured by her people's superior technology and centuries of domination. "Do you understand who I am?" she finally asked, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. Jack's brow furrowed, but he didn't respond immediately. The question was unexpected. She had shown little regard for who he was, only seeing him as a prisoner. But now, she seemed to reconsider that perspective. "You're the one in charge of this ship," Jack said cautiously, still sizing her up. "The one pulling the strings." Elira's eyes darkened at his words, but she didn't look away. "Yes, I am the commander of this vessel, but I am not just the commander," she said, her tone weighted with something ancient. "I am Sarai, born into a legacy of conquest, of empire. We are immortals. Our race has lived for millennia, conquering worlds, subjugating those who stand in our way. But we are not invincible." Jack's pulse quickened at the mention of immortality. Immortal beings. The stories he'd heard growing up about ancient alien species seemed more than just science fiction now. He had read of the Zerai in old conspiracy forums, but never thought they were real. Now, standing in front of him, was one of them, and she was speaking of an empire that had never been defeated. As she spoke, Jack felt an unsettling realization dawn on him. This wasn't just some alien who had come to Earth to take over. She was someone who had witnessed the fall of entire civilizations. She was more than a conqueror. She was a survivor of wars that spanned centuries. Her people had conquered whole galaxies. How could someone like her care about a single human? But then, something changed in Illyra's expression, a flicker of emotion that Jack couldn't identify. It was like a brief shadow crossing her face, something close to regret, before it vanished behind the cold, authoritative mask she had worn for so long. "I have watched your kind for years," Illyra continued, her voice softening. "And yet, I cannot fathom why you continue to resist." She paused, her gaze narrowing. "Perhaps you are not as weak as I thought." Jack stared at her, unsettled by her words. There was something more here, something he didn't understand, and he couldn't tell whether it was a weakness he could exploit or an insight into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. The days blurred together as Jack remained locked in his cell, but the alien commander, Illyra, continued to visit him, though her approach was different each time. At first, her visits were brief, cold, and businesslike, as though she saw him as a mere specimen to observe. But over time, the air between them shifted. There was something increasingly uncertain in her demeanor, something Jack couldn't quite place. Her questions became more probing, her observations more curious. And in those rare moments when she looked at him, it wasn't just the calculating gaze of a conqueror. He began to see something else. Perhaps it was confusion, or even a hint of doubt. One evening, as the ship's artificial lights dimmed and the hum of the vessel seemed to quiet, Illyra entered Jack's cell once again, but this time her face was unreadable. She stood before him, her posture rigid, but there was an unspoken tension between them. For a long moment, she simply stared at him, her expression distant. "Tell me," she said after a long pause, her voice quieter than usual. "How long have you been resisting?" Jack blinked, confused. "Since I woke up here, I guess." "What do you mean?" Illyra took a slow step forward, her eyes never leaving his face. "It's not just you, is it?" she asked. "You resist because of something more. You're not just trying to escape." Her tone was almost speculative, as if she was piecing together some puzzle in her mind. "Your bloodline is older than you know. You're not just a human, Jack Miller." The words struck Jack like a blow. He frowned, trying to make sense of what she was saying. "What are you talking about?" "My bloodline. I'm just a guy from Earth." Illyra's eyes narrowed as she observed him more closely. "You don't know," she murmured, almost to herself. "You can't know." "What?" Jack demanded, his frustration bubbling up. "What's that supposed to mean?" Illyra hesitated for a moment, then spoke again, her voice laced with a strange mixture of awe and regret. "Your ancestors fought against the Zerai millennia ago, Jack. They were part of a resistance we were never able to completely extinguish. You come from a line of warriors who nearly defeated us, a line of humans whose strength and intelligence made them dangerous to us. It was said that their blood held the key to something we could never control." Jack's heart pounded in his chest. This was impossible. His family had never spoken of anything like this. They were farmers, mechanics, regular people. No one had ever told him anything about a grand resistance against aliens. But now, as Illyra continued, something in him stirred. An ancient instinct, buried deep within his blood, began to surface. "Your ancestors," Illyra continued, her voice softening, "waged a war with us that we were not prepared for. But in the end, we wiped them out, almost all of them. You are the last surviving member of that bloodline, Jack, the last human who carries the legacy of their fight." Jack's mind reeled. His father's old war stories, the ones that seemed like childish tales, suddenly didn't seem so fantastical anymore. He wasn't just some ordinary mechanic. He was the descendant of warriors. And if what Illyra said was true, then the Jirai hadn't defeated humanity after all. They had only driven it underground, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now, that moment had arrived. Jack's mind raced, the weight of Illyra's words pressing heavily on him. His ancestors had fought the Jirai. He had come from a line of warriors who nearly brought down an empire. It felt surreal, like some twisted story from a science fiction novel. He had been taken from his life, a mechanic, a nobody, and thrust into a galactic conflict he never asked for. But now, the pieces were falling into place. Illyra's gaze lingered on him, her expression unreadable, but there was something softer there now. The cold, distant air that had surrounded her during their previous encounters was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar vulnerability. She stepped closer, her presence almost overwhelming in the small, confined space of the cell. Jack, still reeling from her revelation, held his ground. His instinct was to lash out, to question her further, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the way she was looking at him, or perhaps it was the strange flicker of regret in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Illyra said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper. Jack's head snapped up, surprised by the sincerity in her tone. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice sharp, disbelief coloring his words. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her eyes locked onto his. "I have lived for centuries, Jack. I've seen civilizations rise and fall, watched worlds burn. I've destroyed countless lives, including your ancestors, without a second thought. But seeing you, seeing the strength you carry within you, it has made me realize something." Jack couldn't hide the skepticism in his eyes. "What's that?" Illyra's face tightened, and for the first time, she looked almost human, vulnerable, conflicted. "I've been wrong. The Jirai have been wrong. I have been wrong." She took a deep breath, as though steeling herself for what she was about to say next. "I watched your kind suffer for generations. I was part of it. I was one of the ones who helped erase your people's legacy. We saw you as nothing but pests. Beneath us, beneath our empire. But now I see. We've made a grave mistake." Jack's mind was spinning. Illyra, this immortal alien, this conqueror who had wiped out entire civilizations, was apologizing. It didn't make sense. Was this some kind of manipulation? Some cruel game she was playing? Or was it something more? "You regret it?" Jack asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and caution. "You regret what you did to my people?" Illyra nodded slowly. "Yes, I regret it. I didn't understand before. I didn't understand what made your kind so resilient. I didn't understand the strength of your will until now. It is not something I can simply undo, but perhaps there is a way forward. Perhaps I can help." Jack felt his anger flare, but it wasn't just anger. It was a mix of emotions, too many to process. "Help. After everything you've done. After all the suffering your people have caused. I know it's hard to believe," Illyra said softly, stepping closer, "but I am trying to make it right. For you. For humanity." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jack didn't know if he could trust her words, but something had changed in him as well. Something in the depths of his heart, a strange flicker of hope mixed with fury. He wasn't sure if Illyra's apology meant anything, or if it was a ploy to manipulate him into cooperating. But if there was even a chance she was sincere, if there was a chance he could use this to fight back, to reclaim what had been lost, he wouldn't ignore it. "Help," Jack repeated, his voice low. "What kind of help?" Illyra's lips parted slightly, her eyes glinting with an emotion Jack hadn't expected. "You're not the only one with a bloodline that could bring down the Jirai Empire," she said quietly. "You are not alone, Jack, and we may just be able to change the course of this war." Jack's pulse quickened as the weight of her words sank in. He had no idea what was coming next, but one thing was clear. The war for Earth's survival had just taken a very unexpected turn. Jack stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as Illyra's words echoed in the stillness of the chamber. We may just be able to change the course of this war. The weight of what she was suggesting hung heavy in the air, and Jack could feel the implications settle into his bones. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, unsure whether to trust what she had just said. Was this some kind of trick? Was Illyra playing a game, hoping to exploit his desperation for escape, for revenge? But then he remembered the way she had looked at him, the flicker of doubt in her eyes when she spoke. There was no denying it. Something had shifted in her. She wasn't the same cold, calculating commander she had been when she first arrived. How? Jack asked finally, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of questions swirling in his mind. How do you think we can change anything? You said it yourself. The Zerai Empire is centuries old. How can one human, one of us, make any difference? Illyra took a step forward, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. It's not just you, Jack, she replied, her voice low and almost reverent. Your bloodline is part of something greater. The resistance was never truly destroyed. There are others out there, hidden. Your ancestors were not the only ones to fight us, and your family has been guarding a secret for generations, one that was never fully understood. You carry the key to what I need to bring down the Zerai. Jack's mind raced. This wasn't just about some vague legacy of warriors or the bloodline that connected him to them. Illyra was talking about something tangible, something real. What secret? What key are you talking about? Illyra's gaze softened, as though the weight of her own knowledge was bearing down on her. She spoke in a quiet voice, almost like she was confiding in him, sharing something dangerous. Your ancestors were not just rebels, Jack. They had discovered something, an ancient weapon, one capable of neutralizing the Zerai's immortality. It is hidden deep within the heart of your bloodline. We, the Zerai, have tried for centuries to uncover it, but we could never find it. No one in your family ever spoke of it, but it's been passed down through generations. And now it is your turn to unlock it. The words hung in the air like a promise. Jack could barely grasp the enormity of what Illyra was saying. His family, had hidden the one thing capable of taking down the Zerai. He couldn't fathom it. The idea that something so powerful was buried within him, within his very DNA, felt like a joke. How could he, a simple mechanic, be the key to ending an empire that had existed for eons? Why tell me this? Jack finally asked, his voice tinged with skepticism. Why are you helping me? After everything. Illyra's expression darkened, her eyes now hard and unyielding. Because, Jack Miller, the Zerai are no longer my people. What I helped build, what we built, is corrupt. I've seen enough to know that we cannot continue. There is no future in conquest, only destruction. Jack studied her, trying to decipher her intentions. Was this some last-minute betrayal? Or had she genuinely come to believe that the empire she had served for so long needed to fall? You still want to fight the Zerai, don't you? Illyra asked, her voice steady, but with a subtle undercurrent of something Jack couldn't place. Jack clenched his fists, his mind made up. Yes, he said firmly. If this is real, if what you're saying is true, then I'll fight. I'll fight for my family. I'll fight for Earth. Illyra's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Then it's time we find that weapon, Jack Miller. The future of humanity depends on it. Jack's heart pounded with a new sense of purpose. This was no longer just about survival. It was about taking back what had been stolen from them, from his ancestors, and reclaiming a future. But as the weight of the battle ahead began to sink in, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Illyra was right about one thing: everything had changed. The days that followed were a blur of planning, covert operations, and fragmented conversations. Jack and Illyra worked together, though their alliance remained fragile, built on an uneasy understanding. She spoke little of her past in the Zerai Empire, and Jack didn't press her for details. But the secret she shared about his ancestors, about the weapon hidden within his bloodline, haunted him. As Illyra continued to explain, Jack learned that the key to the weapon wasn't a physical object, but rather a set of ancient genetic codes locked within the human genome, a sequence hidden in the DNA of his family for centuries. It was a biological key that could activate the weapon, one that had been buried to ensure it wouldn't fall into the wrong hands, or perhaps to keep it from the Zerai, who had tried and failed to unlock it time and time again. But despite this new understanding, Jack's unease lingered. Every moment with Illyra felt like walking a razor's edge. She had apologized, but that didn't mean she could be trusted. She had been a part of an empire that had destroyed so many lives. Even if she was trying to change now, who was to say her old loyalties wouldn't resurface when the moment of truth came? It was during one of their meetings, late one night in the shadowed corridors of the Zerai ship, that Jack's doubts began to crystallize into something far more concrete. Illyra had taken him to the ship's lower levels, where the ancient technologies of the Zerai were kept, intact, pristine, and waiting to be activated. But there was something in the air that felt off, something Jack couldn't shake. "Are we getting close?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They were nearing the section of the ship where the Zerai stored their most dangerous technologies, and Jack's gut instinct told him this wasn't just a mission to find a weapon. There was something else going on. Illyra paused, her back turned to him as she studied a set of symbols on the wall. "We're close," she said, but her tone was oddly distant, her focus too sharp, almost too calculating. Jack didn't know how he knew, but something felt wrong. As she turned to face him, he noticed the subtle shift in her posture. Her once careful demeanor had changed. She was no longer the hesitant commander he had grown used to. She was someone else now, someone colder, more in control. Before he could react, Illyra raised her hand, a hidden device on her wrist flashing to life. In an instant, Jack felt the familiar bite of the restraint cuffs snap tighter around his wrists, as if some unseen force had triggered them. "Illyra, what the hell?" Jack began, his voice laced with fury and disbelief. "You promised me." "I never promised you anything, Jack," Illyra said, her voice icy now, the warmth gone from her tone. "I only told you what you wanted to hear." His chest tightened as the reality of what was happening dawned on him. She hadn't been helping him. She had been using him all along, luring him into a trap. The Zerai hadn't changed. She hadn't changed. "You were never going to help me, were you?" Jack snarled, his heart sinking. "You never intended to let me fight." Illyra's gaze hardened. "I've been hunting that weapon for centuries, Jack. You're just the key. And now, I'll have it." Her voice was calm, almost regretful, as if the betrayal had been a decision she had long ago accepted. Jack's fists clenched, but he could feel the cold metal of the restraints constricting his movements. He had been played. And now he was no longer just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for his very life. The blaring alarms echoed through the ship, their sharp tones a stark contrast to the calm within Jack. He could feel the power of the weapon, his heritage, stirring within him, responding to the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The genetic key, the dormant legacy within him, was finally waking up. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He wasn't just some average human. He was the last of his bloodline, the key to humanity's survival. Illyra's eyes flashed with fury as she lunged toward him, but Jack was faster. He was ready. He had spent days observing the Zerai technology, the intricate systems that held their control. The ship wasn't just a vessel, it was an instrument of power, and now Jack had the means to cripple it. "Illyra," Jack said, his voice steady, colder than he'd ever heard it. "You've made your mistake, and now you're going to pay for it." He slammed his fist into the control panel, causing a cascade of sparks to fly. The ship lurched violently, as if in response to his defiance. The Zerai systems were no longer in control. They were scrambling, malfunctioning in the wake of his interference. Illyra staggered back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You think you can do this? You think you can take down the entire empire?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth was unfolding before them. He could feel the weapon in his blood, ancient, potent, and ready to be wielded. It wasn't just technology that would bring down the Zerai. It was the will of humanity itself, the resilience that had carried his ancestors through the darkness of history. "You've never understood us," Jack said, his voice now carrying the weight of centuries. "We don't give up. We don't quit. Not for anything. Not even against an empire like yours." Elira's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the device on her wrist, her mind racing to regain control. But Jack was already steps ahead. His finger hovered over the emergency trigger, the one that would send the ship into a violent freefall, if he so wished. "You still don't get it, do you?" Jack continued, his voice rising with the growing power within him. "You think you can control everything, but your empire's already dying. You just don't know it yet." The Zerai had always believed in their superiority, their immortality, their empire's unshakable dominance. But they had never encountered humanity's true strength, the strength to rise again, to fight even when the odds seemed impossible. Jack's eyes locked with Elira's, and for the first time, he saw doubt flicker across her face. She was not invincible. Her empire was not invincible. "Jack," Elira said, her voice now a whisper of the cold commander she had once been. "This doesn't have to end like this. You don't have to do this." But Jack was already making his decision. The weapon was in him, the ancient code of humanity's resistance pulsing within his veins. His ancestors had fought for survival. Now it was his turn to finish what they had started. "I have no choice," he said, his voice calm. "I'm not letting you destroy my world." With a single press of a button, the ship shook violently as the weapon's pulse ignited. The Zerai systems scrambled to respond, but it was too late. The ancient weapon embedded in Jack's blood was activated. The Zerai Empire's grip on this galaxy was crumbling, piece by piece, just as his ancestors had intended. As Elira's face contorted in shock and frustration, Jack turned toward the window, watching as the stars outside began to blur and twist, signaling the beginning of the end. Humanity had won, and for the first time in centuries, the future was theirs to reclaim.